Welcome to Mecum Presents On the Move, brought to you by State Farm. It's the show geared toward keeping you up to speed with the latest auto news, event coverage, and expert industry insight. Now, here are your hosts, Matt Avery and John Kraman.
Hey, and welcome to On the Move. We're so glad you've joined us for today's show. I'm Matt Avery, executive producer of The Transmission. Joining me is John Kraman, lead TV commentator for Mecum Auctions. John, what's in store for today's show?
I really like the show today. We're going to have a little bit of a Ford theme in segment 2, Matt. We have got Kevin Marti, and that name is probably familiar to most of our listeners as the guy that runs Marti Auto Works since the early 1980s. So we're going to have some of Kevin's insight on exactly what his business is all about, which actually is primarily on authenticating vintage Fords. And then we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk COPO Chevys. And as you literally wrote the book, which is, of course, COPO, Chevrolet's ultimate muscle cars, available through CarTech, I'd like to have a nice discussion about the COPO Chevy program and maybe dispel a myth or two about the COPO program. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions out there, so it's always fun to kind of pick apart how those legendary cars got built. So really looking forward to that. Before we do, John, let's give listeners an update about what's going on in the world of Mecum. Where do we stand with our events?
Well, the Vinoy auction, the private Vinoy auction, has finished up, and we'll have Frank Mecum on actually next week to give us some insight. He was there at that auction and just could not be any more pleased and gratified with the success of that auction, Matt. It went over really well. It was 5 days, over 5,000 items, just under 100 vehicles. Interest, energy, and prices extremely high across the board. So it's another, in this era, the COVID era, it's another successfully executed Mecum auction, which I think really goes a long way to setting the stage for Mecum Indy coming up.
John, what's the latest with TV coverage of the Indy auction? Yeah,
that's a good question, Matt, because there's a lot of work right now going on between Mecum and NBCSN as far as our schedule. Here's what we know so far. Of course, the auction is going to be July 10th through the 18th. That's a long run, and so far the network has promised us 6 days of television coverage. So I'm going to say that we're going to end up with certainly over 30 hours of coverage from Mecum Indy, and needless to say, it'll be business as usual for all the announcers. All 5 of us are going to be back at business as usual. Everybody's doing great, and we're chomping at the bit to get back on TV.
Now, speaking of news, John, let's talk about some big news in the automotive industry. Ford has unveiled the all-new F-150. First thoughts, John, what do you make of it?
I was a little bit surprised to see the truck, that it really fits the appearance of the existing truck, which we've seen since 2015. But I was surprised to hear that about 80% of the truck is all new. It doesn't look it, but there's very little that shares with the previous generation truck. And you know, that might be smart for Ford not to mess something up as they continue to be dominant in the market, with the F-150 being the #1 selling vehicle in America.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the amount of attention to innovation. It seems like Ford continues to kind of lead the pack with that, with always wanting to make their truck useful to users. Some of the things that caught my eye, I'm sure they did as yours as well, but the fold flat seats for, I guess, some kind of overnight sleeping or some kind of allowing drivers to catch some Z's on the road. That's obviously innovative. The other thing, too, that I really liked was some of the availability of all kinds of different grills and wheels combination. They really seem to understand that truck buyers like to make their truck unique, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and another surprising thing is the electric truck, which we've talked about so much, continues to take up a tremendous amount of the discussion out there in the automotive world. Kind of downplayed a little bit, although they are going to be coming out with a hybrid version. So that'll be interesting to see how well that does. The rest of the power plant seem to be a carryover. Typical choices of V6s, turbo V6s, and even the 5-liter Coyote-based engine is going to be continued as well. But what I thought was really cool, especially for contractors, guys out there working with their trucks, is they are offering a variety of onboard electrical generators and a workstation in the back of the truck to be able to help folks out in the field using their trucks for actual work practice. I think that is really cool.
Yeah, I agree, John. I think that's really neat. I really like they even embossed. It looked like on one of the shots I saw, they embossed a tape measure on the tailgate, like you said, just to kind of help the people that are working using their truck. Nice little features. Of course, as to be expected, we didn't get any word on pricing or any kind of performance from any of the powertrains. That will come closer to when the vehicle goes on sale. John, speaking of powertrains, you got some news about what they're doing with a V8 from the F-250. What's the latest?
Yeah, this was kind of strange. Just this morning, Ford has announced that what they're referring to as Godzilla, 7.3-liter pushrod, kind of an old-school V8 that we first saw in the F-250 back in 2019, has been released as a crate engine. It's rated 430 horsepower. It sells for just a little over $8,000, and I think that's important because it indicates one more time the discussions we've had about Resto Mods and the availability of current contemporary components that can be retrofitted. Here, Ford's coming out with sort of one of their large displacement, kind of a mild performance tune, but that engine is well known to be able to put out with just some tweaking well over 500 horsepower. So it'll be fun to kind of see how well that catches in with the Ford faithful as they are upgrading powertrains.
So John, where do you see that engine being used a lot? What generation truck? We talking about F-250s from the 90s or even older?
I think that would be a great choice for somebody that was wanted to keep within the Ford family and wanted to build maybe a Ford pickup truck from the 50s or the 60s or even into the 1970s, but yet they wanted to keep it all in the Ford family. I think that would be a perfect retrofit. And I think for a plug-and-play bolt-in engine in the $8,000 range, that's the list price. They'll be discounted, I'm sure. It's probably a good way to go, and hopefully Ford will have some success with it.
Now, speaking of success, Ram is hoping to catch some with a announcement that they are going to be releasing a really off-road, hardcore truck in the form of the TRX. A little surprise. It was been teased for the last couple years, made the auto show rounds. Now they're finally moving it to production. John, what do we know about that vehicle?
Yeah, this has been talked about for a long time, and you really got to give a lot of credit to Dodge, Matt, for taking the performance bar and really leading the charge across the board. I don't think there's any denying that, and no surprise that we're going to see the Hellcat V8, the supercharged 6.2-liter that we first saw debut back in 2015 in the Hellcat. To much success. It was rated 707 horsepower at its launch. It's higher now. Is going to be in the truck. They're going to call it the TRX. I hear it might be released as early as this summer as a 2021 model, and it will have a base price under $60,000. Now, I'm sure they've got Ford Raptor right in their sights, but the Ford Raptor currently, with its twin-turbo V6, is rated 450 horsepower. So depending on exactly, we don't know yet what the horsepower rating of this Hellcat-powered Ram TRX truck is going to be, but I'm going to bet that it will be well in excess of the Ford Raptor. Do you think Raptor might counter with their new generation truck with some higher horsepower? What do you think?
Well, there was no news of Raptor as to be expected with the F-150, obviously keeping the focus on that. So the question remains is that will we see a beefed up Raptor to go head to head? I would have to say yes. I mean, performance, like we've talked about, performance trucks continue to do well in the marketplace. And if Ram's going to raise the bar, no doubt Ford's going to be there to respond. It's always curious to me that Chevrolet seems content to kind of stay out of that arena. They've never really done a hopped up off-road truck like that. But Ford and Ram certainly seem focused on it.
Yeah, they've really, Chevy has left it up to the aftermarket companies to do upgrade tuning and suspension parts as opposed to doing it as a factory package. Whether or not that changes in the future, Chevy decides to jump in, we'll keep you posted.
Mecum Auctions is proud to bring you On the Move with Matt Avery and John Kraman. For more on the world of collector cars, head over to Mecum.com. Now let's get back to the show.
Joining us now is Kevin Marti of Marti Auto Works. Kevin, thanks so much for stopping by.
Yeah, how you doing, John and Matt?
Hey, we are so happy to have you with us, Kevin. You've had a chance to meet and hang out with us before, but I think our listeners are really going to be happy with hearing your words on how it all began. Let me just begin by saying that representing those of us in the car world, those of us that are Ford nuts, really appreciate all of your efforts. As I'm going to go ahead and stick my neck out and say you're considered to be the top authenticator for Ford Motor Company, but the reality is Marti Auto Works is a lot more than just authenticating Fords. How did it all begin for you?
Well, it's funny, you said Fords several times in those sentences. It started out with me trying to buy a 68 or 69 Camaro or Chevelle back when I was 16. And as it turned out, everything I was looking at in 1973 was in pretty ratty shape. And as I kept looking at Camaros and Chevelles, couldn't find anything good. My mom one day grabbed the newspaper and said, let's go look at some cars. And she just grabbed anything that started with the letter C. As it turned out, one of the cars on the list was a Cougar. And she said, well, let's go look at that anyway. I wound up buying it. I became a Ford guy instead of a Chevy guy on that turn of just that small twist of fate. And I actually still have that car to this day. From there, at a certain point in time, I had contacted Ford about my car, and they sent me back a bunch of information. And I thought, how would they know all that stuff just from the VIN? And it started occurring in my mind that they must have some more data somewhere. And over a decade went by before I started thinking about that more seriously. In the meantime, I had then started the parts business that Marti Auto Works also has, that is manufacturing items like basically underhood engine detailing items, rubber products, battery cable, spark plug wires, heater hoses, vacuum hoses, etc. And I wound up thinking again in the mid-90s about that letter I received from Ford, wound up contacting them. They confirmed they had the data after a couple of years worth of going back and forth with various departments at Ford. We wound up getting the approvals. By then I'd been married. My wife became very involved with this too. And so Shelley and I wound up getting all of this data from Ford. And it now has grown to the point where we've got over 150 million records of all the vehicles built by Ford since 1967.
So, Kevin, take us down a list of all of the products and services that you currently offer, and is there anything that's brewing in the future?
Sure. We on the parts side of it, again, we do radiator hoses, battery cables, spark plug wires, the heater hoses, vacuum hoses, rubber fuel lines. We're the company that makes the Wittech clamps that were used both on Ford and GM vehicles. So I'm still got my little bit of GM connection there. And on the other parts that we do are all of the tags that were used on the cars. We make carb tags, axle tags, engine tags, rear axle tags, the owner cards that came in the glove box originally for these vehicles, and then our biggest tag happens to be the what a lot of people call door data plates or patent plates or vehicle certification labels. It just depends upon what year, because they took different forms, but it's basically kind of like the birth certificate for the car that contains the VIN of the car plus information about the color, trim, axle, transmission, and such. So that's the parts side, and our other contract with Ford is this intellectual property that includes us producing the Marti report as you guys mention quite often on the auctions, which we do appreciate. We do appreciate the recognition for that. We make 3 versions of that report: a standard, a deluxe, and an elite, and they each have different purposes depending upon whether you're just looking at a vehicle or whether you're like hardcore serious about it and you want to put something very nice on the wall. So we do those, but we also can run, because we have all of the data of every single vehicle, we can run statistical analysis. So we can determine things like, if you wanted to know how many 1969 Mach 1 Mustangs were painted candy apple red with the black Mach 1 interior and a 428 Cobra Jet ram air engine with a 4-speed that happened to have a console we can make that determination of that exact number. That's why a lot of times when you see someone says, well, my car is one of this many, they were able to get that information from us. But in addition to those personalized production stats, as we call them, we also reproduce window stickers for the cars under a license with Ford. So these are authentic. They're not made up. They're winding up coming from the actual Ford data. So even the dealer info is actually correct for that particular dealer at that particular time. Because as we know, dealers change hands and they move and such. But we've got all of that information. So we wind up being able to produce a correct window sticker for the vehicle also. In addition, as you mentioned, I do look at vehicles for people to verify whether they're correct or not. And I know coming down a little further in the segment, we were talking about one special car that Mecum was recently involved with, having to do with exactly that of me looking at cars. So that's a broad overview.
What year, makes, and models are you currently able to provide this type of build information for?
Everything from 1967 through 2017, and it doesn't matter. And strangely enough, like I just ran a report for a Flex yesterday. We get people that have got, you remember the old LN7s? We will have people that ask for reports for those, for Pintos. Of course, the big one is always the Mustang. Most of the business is Mustang, but just like I'm sure you, John, you know the way the old classic trucks, especially for Ford, the F-Series and Bronco, are becoming so popular. Well, we saw those trends. See, we get to see trends before they happen. We started seeing lots and lots of people ordering more and more reports for the F-Series trucks plus the Bronco. So we always get kind of a glimpse of the future, where the market is headed by when you've got all the records for everything, and then you start seeing where it's interesting people, you can start saying, oh, this is what's coming up. So, and especially lately because of the new Bronco that's going to be coming out, there's been a real surge in interest in those late 60s and then the 70s Broncos.
Kevin, when it comes to all that data, how have you found that Ford treats that? You mentioned you're pulling a report for a pretty modern Flex. After a certain amount of years, does Ford purge that, and is it up to people like you to safeguard it?
Well, interestingly, Ford used to purge their data. In fact, back in the old days, they used to store all this on mag tape. It was this 1-inch wide tape, and it looked like an old reel-to-reel tape recorder that these were put on. I actually talked to the data processing manager who one day got a memo back in the 80s saying we need a tape for loading some data on. Would you take one of those old tapes that's got the 1966 data on it, and would you erase that so that we can put some other data on it? So with that single memo, poof, all the 1966 data went away. By the time we get to 1967, interestingly, because of good old Ralph Nader, and because of the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, Ford was required to hang on to their data for recall purposes. In fact, a lot of people aren't aware, but like 68 Mustangs and Cougars had a recall for a seat back release problem. So these things started having to hang on to the data a little bit longer. Well, they hung on to it long enough that by then it started becoming cheap to store data. So they've actually retained the data. The trouble is the data is raw data. And so without any decoding material, you can look at the data and it wouldn't mean much to you. It looks like a bunch of random numbers and letters in an 80 column or 160 column format. But we've got all of the decoding material that goes along with that. There's literally 1,000 books that I have, and a lot of that, and nowadays it's all electronic. Even the decoding material is electronic. So we've taken all of that, written computer programs that take it and decode it so that it gets presented in an intelligent, readable fashion in the Marti report.
Kevin, with such an interest and passion for documenting Fords, is it safe to assume that that's what your collection is made up of, or do you have some other makes and models in there too?
Yeah, it's well, first off, so to go back to that Cougar story, as I say, I still have that 67 Cougar. I also have the second car I bought, a 1970 Cougar, XR7 convertible. I also have the third car I bought, a 1970 Cougar Eliminator, which really was the reason why this business got started. And since then, I have, I finally wound up buying a 66 Mustang. It took years to get that car, and then we bought a 68 Mustang convertible for my wife. We wind up newer part of our collection. My wife has one of the 07 Hertz convertibles. Because the only kind of car my wife will drive is it has to be black and gold. That's just her thing, and so Hertz cars wind up working out real well in that mix. Then my daily driver happens to be a 2013 GT500 convertible. Interestingly, that was the factory test car. In fact, it was built on the very day that Carroll Shelby died. So I kind of like to think his spirit went into the car.
Big news. You had teased us a little bit on it, Kevin, in regards to a very special car that Mecum sold this year at Kissimmee, Florida. And I think most of our listeners have an idea what we're going to be talking about. But the owner of that car was Sean Kiernan. And I know prior to you getting involved in taking a look at this car and evaluating this car, you had established a relationship with Sean. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay. To wind back a little bit further than that, I would have people ordering Marti reports for the two VINs were known out there for the two cars that were used in the movie Bullitt. And so periodically I'd get reports ordered by people. I always ask the question, we have certain numbers, certain VINs flagged in the system as being significant vehicles, whether it's the Boss 302 that Edsel Ford received that was, so can you imagine getting a car in primer? His dad, the Deuce, ordered the car for his son in primer so that he could get it painted whatever color he wanted after he saw the car. So we have those special cars flagged like that. And when I'd get people ordering those, I always ask the question, do you actually own this car, or are you ordering it more as a novelty? And in the case of, so when Sean contacted us and said, I actually have Bullitt. And I have a lot of skepticism because we deal with fraud virtually every day. There's all kinds of people out there that are trying to pull a fast one, as I'm sure you guys also in the auction business, you get to see that stuff all the time. You have to turn away certain people. So we had made arrangements for me to come and view the car. And I always wear my skeptic's hat when I walk in. I went there with John Clore, Ford Communications, and both of us were very excited about, wow, I hope this is the real thing, but I don't know. John, I've seen a lot of bad attempts. So when we get there and look at it, it's like, wow, it sure looks like the real thing. But the first thing I do, because it's a 68, they used an aluminum VIN tag, and because it's riveted to steel, you get a reaction called a galvanic reaction that deteriorates the aluminum in a particular fashion. And so when it's 50 years old, it just has a certain look to it that's hard to duplicate. You can't age metal that fast. So I look at that tag and I see, wow, that it's the right VIN. It's got all that aging. And in that instant, that skepticism just turned into a joy and excitement. And of course, I was real happy for the Kiernan family. Although I thought later, they already knew they had the real thing. It's not like I was telling them something. But that's been a very special time in our lives for the last few years.
Last question for you, Kevin. That car, as we know, sold for over $3.7 million at Mecum Kissimmee 2020. Did the excitement and the energy and then the ultimate sale price surprise you with that car, or did you expect it all along?
I pretty much expected that, although I will tell you this. My estimate was slightly lower, but my wife said, I think it'll sell for $3.75 million. So Shelley was a whole lot closer than I was about it. But no, that's been an exciting time, and still enjoy the involvement with that. It was, you were there too. There was the energy in that room when that car came in and the bidding started. I mean, that happened so fast. I had one friend that was in the bidding, and he had a number in his head, and it went up so fast. He said, I was out in 15 seconds. It was just that exciting. But he just couldn't believe, wow, I sort of owned the car for a few seconds.
Kevin, are there any other notable Fords that are still out there waiting to be discovered and brought to light?
Yeah, there sure are. In fact, if it hadn't been for COVID, I was going to be looking at a particular one that I'm under an NDA about right now. But yeah, there are plenty of more great stories out there, and as the years unfold, so will these stories.
Well, Kevin, we certainly appreciate your time. If people want to learn more about Marti Auto Works, where's the best place for them to head?
Website is pretty simple, www.martiauto.com. That's MARTIAUTO.com.
Kevin, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today, and promise me we can get you on in the future to keep us posted on all things Ford. Much appreciated, my friend.
All right, John and Matt, good to talk with you.
Don't adjust that dial. On the Move, we'll be right back. Our program is proudly presented by Mecum Auctions, the world's largest collector car auctions. Now back to Matt and John.
Hey, Matt, let's talk COPOs. And before we begin, let's define exactly what it stands for. Central Office Production Order was a Chevrolet program that over the years has developed a bit of a reputation. Now, really glad to be talking to you about it because you literally are the guy that wrote the book on COPO history. So what was it initially intended to be all about?
The primary function that it served was to allow customers to make changes to vehicles that they were ordering that fell outside of Chevy's regular production option ordering structure. So in the 1960s, it's utilized for performance, but that was never the intention. When the paperwork starts to surface in the 1940s, late 1940s, all through the 50s, you see it specifically for commercial applications. So that makes a lot of sense because obviously during that time, we have a big influx of returning servicemen and women coming back, starting new businesses, and going into showrooms and needing vehicles to help them do their jobs. So different examples you might hear of or would be someone going in and saying, hey, I want to start a plumbing business. I need 3 trucks, but can they be painted in this particular color that closely matches my logo? So something like that paint color may not be offered as an RPO, but if the salesman or the sales staff, they could run it up the flagpole and put in a central office production order to honor that request.
What did Chevrolet require once the performance guys in the 1960s began to recognize that this program existed? What did Chevrolet do to try to accommodate these players, and who were some of the early innovators in putting this in the mainstream?
First, let's talk about why it was necessary. Why did Chevrolet during the 1960s even need to use paperwork like the COPO process to build high-performance cars? And the reason is that they were trying to avoid government intervention. It was one of the ways that they kept that at bay. So the government, several officials had started to open up investigations just because of the raw size of Chevrolet. They were so much larger than their competitors, big player in the marketplace, and some government officials thought that they might need to step in and regulate and possibly break up Chevrolet. So obviously they don't want that. And so one of the measures that they take is that they back away from racing, they back away from performance, just as a way to kind of show that, hey, they're a respectable company, they're not building unsafe vehicles. So that's where you see the necessity of COPO, because obviously Chevrolet, they're corporate, insiders, they want to keep their cars in first place, but they also want to keep the government at bay. So that's the delicate balance that Chevrolet was in. So in terms of what was necessary, Chevrolet worked with dealer partners is probably the best way to phrase it. Partners like Don Yenko, Fred Gibb. Obviously, Chevrolet wanted to build fast cars. And so when dealers started to inquire about and started dialogue about what could be done, Chevrolet was more than happy to figure out a way to make that happen. Now let's talk about the players. First up, you have Vince Piggins. He is Chevy's manager of product performance. He's going to be the corporate insider that can help facilitate all these kind of special skunk work projects, especially the ones that deal with performance and speed like these do. From there, you have outside dealer partners that order the inventory of cars. You have the big ones being Don Yenko of Yenko Chevrolet in Cannonsburg, Pennsylvania, as well as Fred Gibb of Gibb Chevrolet in La Harpe, Illinois. From there, you have a third wild card, and that's Dick Harrell. He's a professional drag racer hailing from New Mexico. He kind of gets caught up in the mix when he takes a job with Nicky Chevrolet in Chicago. Nicky does not order COPOs, but they hire him to spearhead their 427 conversion program. So he quickly learns how to merchandise speed, and then once he gets connected with, he works both with Gibb and Yenko at different points, and so he really serves as that kind of speed consultant, giving those dealers ideas of what can be done to make these cars faster.
So what do you consider really to be sort of the transitional area from the shift of some very light modifications on the Corvair to prepare them for road racing, but then taking it to an extreme for high-performance street cars, now these cars being ordered by the folks that you had mentioned? When did that transition really begin? Kind of get into a little bit more detail on that. And when did it end? When did all this come crashing down?
Well, by far, the high water mark is in 1969 and 1970. That's where Chevrolet starts to not only just change out parts and pieces, but now they are installing completely different engines than they are making available through a regular production option. So that's a big game changer. So Yenko takes advantage of it in 1969 by ordering both Camaros and Chevelles with the L72 Iron Block 427. Other dealers follow suit. And then likewise, also in 1969, Gibb leads the way in getting the very exotic all-aluminum ZL1 V8 installed in 50 Camaros. 19 more are built. And then a similar big project happens in 1970 with Yenko ordering 175 COPO Novas that have their L65 350 cubic inch V8 swapped out for the much hotter LT1. So where the COPO program kind of fizzles out is in 1970, later in the year. There is a Camaro. It does not have anything done to the powertrain, but rather it actually has a high back spoiler for improved downforce while racing. And then the final COPO project, again for performance, are 400 Vegas that Yenko orders in 1971 and 1972 that under COPO 9734 have forged alloy plated pistons installed. So that's kind of the arc, the rise and fall of the COPO performance vehicles.
Is it safe to say that Chevrolet never really promoted this program, or did Was it limited to a select dealers? How did somebody even find out about this program from a dealer standpoint to be able to order these cars?
Yeah, officially, the COPO program for modifying vehicles for performance was never officially pushed or promoted. It doesn't show up in any kind of advertising or commercials, nothing like that. It really was a backdoor program, which adds to the heightened level of interest and intrigue today with collectors and enthusiasts, because the cars really do have a fascinating story about how they got created. Now, that's going to raise the question then, how did dealerships, hear about it to take advantage of it? And the simple answer is Vince Piggins was accessible to them, and being a racing enthusiast himself, he was going to pay particular attention to Don Yenko and Fred Gibb when requests come in to talk about what could be done to build higher performance cars. So he's going to be more than happy to facilitate that and to get those kind of cars built. Now, it's important to note that when the cars arrived in showrooms, that typically customers had no idea about how they got created, and frankly, they didn't care. I've talked to numerous original owners that bought these cars new, and when they went into a showroom, when it comes to Yenko marketed his car so heavily with Yenko Stinger and Yenko Deuce, they just knew they wanted one of those cars. They didn't know it had a COPO behind it, none of that kind of stuff. Same thing with the L72 Camaros, is that when customers went into the showroom, they didn't hear COPO Camaro, they just heard 427 Camaro, and that's what they wanted.
One of the really cool, hot COPO-inspired cars that was a sign of the times was the high-performance version of the Nova, the Yenko Deuce, where the 350 cubic inch LT1 engine out of the Corvette, and of course the 70 Z20 Camaro also had that engine standard. That was part of the COPO program, and that was to give a high-performance small block, maybe to try to get underneath the radar screen of the insurance companies surcharging and different things that were going on. Did that program surprise you in an era filled with big blocks, or was that kind of just a sign of the times?
To me, that really speaks to Don Yenko's innovation. He had a skilled eye towards not only reading, but adapting to the marketplace to deliver the kind of products that his customers wanted. And his Deuce is a perfect example of that. As 1969 draws to a close, Don is recognizing that big block power is on its way out, as now insurance agencies are clamping down on insuring these hot cars for young drivers. Don recognizes, hey, let's change up the formula to still get those enthusiasts the kind of cars that they want to buy. So what he does is, under COPO 9010, he orders 175 Novas that are officially marked as coming with the L65 350 cubic inch V8 that only had 140 horsepower. But through that COPO, it's exchanged for the LT1 350 V8 that delivers 360 horsepower. So very clever, very innovative, and to say nothing of his ability to market the final cars. The Deuce is, again, another good example of the uniformity that he put into the additions that he added to the car in terms of the stripes and the wheels and the badges, to the point where, to the untrained eye, it really looks like something that could have come right from Chevrolet.
Well, Matt, thanks so much. The guy that wrote the book. More COPO information can be found in his book. It's COPO Chevrolet's Ultimate Muscle Cars, available through CarTech. And we hope you've enjoyed some COPO information.
You've been listening to Mecum Presents On the Move, brought to you by State Farm. For more information, visit Mecum.com. And join us again next time as we take you inside the world of muscle and collector cars and more.